Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm Audrey Smith, and this is Leandra Merz for PhD students in the Department of Geography. And today we're going to give a talk on a paper that we did with co-authors Jesse Borden, Chris Gulick, Akil Schurschager, and Dr. Amelia Bruna that came out of a class project, a group project from Dr. Bruna's scientific publishing class. In which we learned a lot about the publishing process and journals and open access. So this was our group project that we continued to work on with Dr. Bruna to get published. And it was just recently published in, what the heck is it called? QSS, Quantitative Scientific Studies. So the name of the paper is Assessing the Effect of Article Processing Charges on the Geographic Diversity of Authors using Elsevier's Mirror Journal System. So a background, what is open access publishing in general? It's basically the free and unrestricted online availability of scholarly literature. It's also a broad international movement that is seeking to promote this open scholarship where there's online access to academic information, including publications, but also data. It's also a publishing model for scholarly communication. And this makes research available to readers at no cost, which is in contrast to traditional subscription model in which readers have to access information and publications by paying a subscription or paywall fee. A publication is defined as open access when there are no financial, legal, or technical barriers to accessing it. So in the recent couple decades, there's really been a rise of open access scientific publishing and a push for it. It was basically propelled by the fusion of opportunities provided by the ubiquitous of the World Wide Web for the instant distribution and the idea or the principle that publicly funded research should be freely available and that we should promote the inclusion and equity of the scientific community and scholarly communication. So before about 2000, most research papers were published in journals that could be read by scholars or the general public if they paid a subscription, or often it's paid by a university's library subscription to access these journals. But since 2000, the growth of the web has been accompanied by the emergence of the push for open access publishing, and it has risen substantially in the past couple of decades. And now it's estimated that nearly half of all articles published may be available via open access. So just to review, there's different ways of publishing, which most of you probably know. There's the traditional model of subscription journals, which are also called paywalled, and these are non-open access journals. They require a cost to access them. Either, as I mentioned before, either readers have to pay themselves a subscription, or a university may gain access to these journals for their students and professors, et cetera, to access papers published in these journals. Fully open access journals, or gold open access, are freely available online. There are no cost to readers or the general public to access. However, in order to offset the publishing fees that usually traditional models accrue through subscription fees, these journals may require article processing charges, or APCs. And this is the responsibility of the author or authors to pay this in order to have their research published in these open access journals. Hybrid journals are publication of articles through this hybrid platform where there are subscription journals that allow open access publication of some individual articles, whereas others within that journal are paywalled or closed. And these OA publications within hybrid journals generally require the author payment of article processing charges. Open access publishing and research has a lot of advantages, as most of you are probably aware. Of course, the ability for people to access it online free of charge, the general public and researchers all over the world. This increases its equitability and exclusivity, and it removes these financial barriers for individuals or researchers, students, or people in lower income societies or countries that don't have the financial resources to pay the subscription fees for traditional journals, non-open access journals. Additionally, they have a greater impact as they reach a broader audience and reach an audience more quickly. And they additionally improve transparency of publicly funded research. And there's also the requirement of a lot of publicly funded research to be published OA these days, open access. And open access can also drive innovation as businesses, organizations have access to scientific literature and information that can be used to inform their business models and just furthering technology and the process of knowledge sharing. And lastly, they are also free of most copyright and licensing restrictions, whereas if you publish open access, you can offer preprints of your article, you can put it in a repository, and you can also share it widely without these copyright or licensing restrictions. Specifically for authors, there are a lot of benefits to publishing open access. As I just mentioned previously, the complying with funder policies when publicly funded or federally funded research is often required to be published open access. It increases the visibility of a researcher's work as it is viewed by more readers, it's downloaded more often. And they also, open access articles often also have an increased citation rate. They garner a higher citation rate than non-open access articles. And metrics like these help promote a researcher's or scientist's career advancement. So this is also important in the career advancement of researchers, especially emerging scholars. And there's, of course, a global impact of open access, just given the wider, broader audience reach and greater visibility of these open access articles. But what we're looking at are these barriers. Are there barriers to publishing open access for authors? Why don't all authors publish open access? One barrier is the perception of journal reputation. There's some hesitancy. Other studies have shown that there's some hesitancy among authors to publish in open access journals if they don't know that it's as prestigious as these traditional journals, or maybe it has not yet acquired a high impact factor. And of course, impact factor is something we're always looking at publishing, and there's the desire to publish in journals of high impact factors. There was also just a sort of reluctancy when open access first began among some segments of the research community, thinking that this was sort of jet-setting the established process of submission to traditional subscription journals. And then we have the financial barrier. Although a lot of open access journals do not charge authors to publish, quite a few do charge article processing charges for authors to publish in these open access journals. And this is to offset that cost of what they're losing from subscription fees. However, this puts a large financial burden on many researchers, including independent researchers, researchers from the global south or low-income countries who have less access to financial resources, also students and others lacking institutional support or other funding. So although, as I said, a lot of open access journals, or some of them do not charge these article processing fees, many do, and most of the articles published open access are published in the prestigious open access journals that do charge APCs. This figure shows you some of the fees for leading open access articles. So this can become quite a barrier for some researchers. And this is the question of this research. Are these article processing charges a barrier to authors? And does it decrease author diversity?
So moving more into our research, we primarily wanted to see if APCs or article processing charges affect the geographic diversity of author communities. And we predicted that the geographic diversity of authors publishing OA articles or open access articles would be lower than that of non-open access articles because of the financial burden of APCs. And we thought that lower author diversity in traditional or non-open access journals is due to open access articles having fewer lead authors from low-income countries predominantly located in the global south. So we think that any change in geographic diversity would be most noticed in low-income countries of the global south. And to test this out, we used Elsevier's mirror journal system. This is a relatively new system that provides kind of an ideal natural experiment design because they have traditional parent subscription journals that are paired with a new journal of almost the same name that's called a mirror journal. So in this image, you can see World Neurosurgery is the traditional parent journal, and the mirror journal is World Neurosurgery X. And the idea is that both of these journals have the same aim and scope, the same potential author base, the same editorial process and criteria for submission. And in fact, when you submit, even the editors don't necessarily know which journal you submitted to. So that helps control for any potential differences in why someone might choose an OA journal versus a non-OA journal. And the parent journal essentially is our control group, and the mirror journal is our treatment group that involves a high APC. And these APCs range from about $1,300 to $4,000. So we're talking about a significant sum of money. And for our data and methodology, we had 38 paired parent and mirror journals. And we downloaded all of the reference records for articles that were published starting in January 2020, when these journals first came online, through July. And for each article, we identified whether it was published in OA or non-OA. And this is important for parent journals because they are technically hybrid. So they allow authors to choose if they want to publish the traditional subscription version or make their individual article open access in the parent journal without publishing in the mirror journal. So this makes it a little more complicated, but we had to tease out whether or not it was OA or non-OA in the parent journals. And then we identified where the first author's country of primary institutional affiliation was. And we assigned this based on the World Bank region where the country was located, the lending group or national income level, and the potential Elsevier APC waiver group. And we're going to talk about waivers a little bit later. And once we had all this information, we could use diversity indices to identify changes in diversity. And we used R to collect and analyze all of our data. So for our quantifying geographic structure, we basically used diversity metrics that are common in ecology to think of author communities and looking at the richness or the number of different countries that were represented by authors, as well as evenness, which is how even each country was represented. So if you have one country that represents 99% of the submissions, and then maybe 100 other countries that split the other 1%, that's not very even. So we're looking not at just the total number, but how evenly spread the geographic diversity is. And we specifically used a reciprocal transformation of Simpson's index, and that equation is here. And to look at diversity of authors, we compared all different article types. So I mentioned that our parent journals are technically hybrid. So we teased out OA articles that were published in mirror journals, OA articles that were published in parent journals, as well as non-OA articles that were published in parent journals. And we used permutation tests to compare across groups, and we looked at significance by calculating p-hat. And we chose to look at both single authored papers as well as the first authors of co-authored papers. And this gets a little tricky because we don't necessarily know which author was funding the research, and we can't really tease that out from our end. So single authored papers help because we know there's only one author involved, so there are less potential variables going on. But we also, for simplicity's sake, looked at just the first author of co-authored papers. And we had to deal with some differences in sample size because our parent journals have been around for a long time. A lot of people know about them, and there were significantly more articles published in parent journals over that time period than there were in the mirror journals, which are relatively new and fewer people probably knew about them at the time. So we used bootstrapping to basically compare an equal sample of articles from non-OA articles from the parent journals to the same number of samples from the OA mirror journals, just so that we could compare those two groups. And one thing we quickly noticed as we started looking at these results is that 45% of the articles overall were published by lead authors either in the US or in China. So this made it really difficult for us to look at evenness when we had two countries that were just overwhelming the sample. So we actually pulled out those, and you'll see in our results, we look at both all countries, and then we excluded the US and China just so that we could get a better understanding of evenness that's not so overwhelmed by these two countries that publish the most.
So just from our preliminary analysis of all the articles, there are 975 articles in the OA mirror journals. And as Leandra was saying, it was quite a difference in sample size. There were more than 36,000 articles in the parent journals, of which around 18,000 were open access articles. And with all the journals and article categories pooled, the lead authors were collectively based in a total of 144 countries. But as you can see, these are not even across the different national income categories of countries. So these are beautiful graphs that Amelia made. So what we're looking at here is the single authored articles and the lead authors of those co-author articles. And we're using lead author and single author interchangeably. Although the numbers of countries were actually varied quite a bit among the different article types. So, for instance, the higher income countries dominated all article types across the board, both single authored and lead authors of co-authored articles. Then next we see that middle income countries were quite underrepresented. We'll discuss this more later. In OA articles, and then low income countries we barely had any articles where lead authors were from low income countries in both parent journals and mirror journals. So some of our first results, and this shows how we, as Leandra mentioned, chose to exclude China and the USA as they were dominating the analysis and skewing the evenness metric. So for single author articles, the diversity of open access single author articles was actually lower than the diversity of the non-open access articles. And then for first authors of co-authored articles, when we include all countries, the diversity of open access articles was greater than the non-open access diversity. And then when we excluded China, the dominant countries of China and USA, because they had published the majority of articles and were skewing our analysis, open access diversity was lower than non-open access diversity. This is a breakdown of the global regions using that World Bank category. And this shows the percentage of authors in each region. And so we can see that, again, North America is dominating a lot of the publications. And we have very few from Sub-Saharan Africa. And we have a variety from South Asia and the Middle East to North Africa, East Asia, and the Pacific. So as far as these global regions, there was a similar number of countries, but there's quite a difference in the frequency from these regions and of these different countries. So for the mirror open access articles, there were substantially more authors from North America, as I mentioned, Europe, Central Asia, East Asia, Pacific region, when we compare it to the parent non-open access articles. And there were fewer authors from Latin America, Caribbean, Middle East, North Africa, and very few from Sub-Saharan Africa. And for the parent non-open access articles, there were more authors from Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Middle East, North Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And these are the parent open access articles that are free to publish in, keep in mind. So looking into the national income groups, once again, there were very few authors from low income countries. And then we would see more authors from, if you want to jump in, from lower middle income countries. And upper middle income countries were poorly represented in general, as were also lower middle income. And high income countries were, not surprising, the most represented, with the highest percentage of authors in this national income category. So I more or less just said this, but when we looked at these mirror open access journals, so these are the ones charging the article processing fees, middle income countries were very much underrepresented, surprisingly. And most of the authors were likely to be based in the high income countries of the global north. And generally the low income categories of countries did not seem to be publishing OA, open access, at all. Now, when we look at the parent non-open access articles that are free to publish in, there's nearly an identical proportion of subscription only articles in the parent journals that had first authors based in upper middle and high income countries.
So basically our results strongly suggest that these article processing charges, or APCs, are a barrier to publishing in open access journals. And authors who publish in open access journals are typically concentrated in high income countries in the US, North America, and Europe. And it's these middle income countries that are actually the most underrepresented in open access compared to non-open access. So this was a little bit surprising. We kind of expected the lower income countries to be the most disadvantaged. And as you saw in our lovely figures, these lower income authors from lower income countries are rarely publishing at all. And even though it's slightly lower in open access, it's not much different from the non-open access, because authors from these lower income countries are just hardly publishing. And when they are publishing, it's mostly from just a few low income countries. Ethiopia, North Korea, Nepal, and Syria were the majority. More than half of the few articles that were published were based in just those 4 countries. And then these middle income countries were the ones who they were publishing quite a bit in the traditional non-open access journals, but they were hardly publishing at all in the open access journals. So that was kind of the biggest group that was impacted by the APCs. And surprisingly, these authors from low income countries are eligible for waivers from Elsevier for 100% of their APC to be covered by Elsevier. And still very few, hardly any of them were publishing in open access, which was kind of surprising. So if we think more about these APC waivers, waivers are kind of how the open access journals try to deal with diversity and equity in terms of the funding mechanism of article processing charges. So they might offer full or partial waivers to certain qualifying authors to help offset those costs. These can get tricky because it depends on the journal in terms of what they offer, and the awareness of authors might vary. It might not be very blatantly displayed on their website for authors to know if they are eligible for waivers. Even if they know that they're eligible, they might not know how to apply, or the application process itself might make people less comfortable applying. They might feel that by applying, they will be considered differently and their research may be rejected instead of published simply because they asked for a waiver, or there might be other discriminatory factors that kind of preclude some people from applying. Also, the author eligibility varies. Usually it's simply based on the country that you are affiliated with. And if you are in one of these co-authored papers, it gets even trickier, because if you are lead author, but you're publishing, even though you're from a low income country that has a potential 100% waiver, if you have a co-author who's from a high income country that's not offered a waiver, they might disqualify the entire paper. So this makes it even trickier for collaborations and for even understanding which authors and which papers are eligible for waivers. To make it even more complicated, Elsevier actually has a very clear list of which countries are considered eligible for 100% waivers or 50% waivers or no waivers. And these are not strictly based off of national income level. So looking at World Bank's classification of low income groups, we see that most of them are eligible for 100% of a waiver. But when we get to middle income groups, it's a lot trickier. So we have countries in the same region that are considered middle income countries that get very different waiver statuses. For example, Nicaragua gets 100% waiver, Guatemala gets 50% waiver, and Costa Rica gets no waiver. Similarly, if you look at Rwanda, Gabon, and South Africa, in Africa and in Asia, Cambodia, Vietnam, and China, you see, even though they're all technically middle income countries, Elsevier treats their waiver eligibility very differently. And even for some high income countries, they might receive a 50% waiver depending on the country. So this brings up another level of complexity. And we actually looked at the different waiver groups and found that groups that receive 100% waivers are still hardly publishing in open access, even though their cost to publish could be completely free. And then these 50% waiver groups still have very few people from these countries that are publishing in open access. And this might be for some of the reasons that we just mentioned. It might also be that 50% is not enough. If you're talking about $4,000, even if half is covered, you might not be able to afford the $2,000 to publish the rest. And then finally, for the no waiver groups, it seems like a lot of these people are still able to publish, and we have high publication representation from the no waiver group. So all in all, our results suggest that the waiver programs that are designed to increase the representation of scientists from the Global South in the open access literature by reducing the cost of APCs have at best failed to do so, and at worst, they might have the opposite effect. So we make some specific recommendations on how we could improve representation and make publishing more accessible and inclusive to authors from all different regions and national income groups. First of all, we need to make waivers more effective. We need to rethink how we can reach authors, individual authors who are most disadvantaged, and not look strictly at country of affiliation. Also, the waiver program typically only applies to the fully open access journals like the mirror journals. It does not always apply to hybrid journals, which makes it more challenging to publish in open access. The lack of clear communication on websites about APCs in general is a major barrier to even using the waivers. And if we could introduce an automatic recognition of authors who are eligible for waivers and inform them of that during the submission process, instead of relying on them actually applying for the waiver separately, that might make it more accessible. And then reevaluating how we deal with co-authors and collaborations that include authors from different regions, some who might be eligible and some who might not. And then finally, specifically from our research, really trying to focus on how we can reach this group of people from middle income countries who seem the most disadvantaged. So there are definitely some limitations and caveats of our work. We use the mirror system because it helps eliminate a lot of the differences in terms of publishing in open access or non-open access, because the journals have the same scope, the same editorial board, the same submission process. But we do recognize that when an author sits down to decide where to publish, this is a really complex decision that is based on a lot of other factors. And there might be things going on there that we are not catching in this analysis. Also, there may be some editor biases against authors from certain regions that might limit how those people are publishing. And certainly the fact that English is the language that most of these journals are published in all of these journals are published in, and so differences in language might influence that. However, that doesn't really change our results because you would expect to see those limitations across both open access and non-open access since it's the same editorial board and the same process. And then finally, we can't really assess what's going on in these multi-authored papers. We look at lead authors as a representative of the paper and what institution the lead author is based in, but different disciplines have different roles for first, second, last author. So this can vary a lot and we're not able to pick up that, which is also why we tried to look also at the single authored papers to kind of eliminate some of that. And we do have some suggestions for future work, trying to look more at individual author preference and what other decision-making processes are going on when people decide whether they should submit to an open access or non-open access journal. And specifically for this work, we see the potential that these mirror journals are very new. They don't have an impact factor yet because they haven't been around long enough to get one. We don't know for sure what their impact factor is going to be when it is assigned. The fact that they're new, they might not be as well known or recognized. Those can all kind of factor into authors' decision on where to submit. We also were not able to look at any trends over time or space because relatively few articles have been published in these mirror journals to date. But as more and more get published, we could potentially repeat this same analysis and looking at how things change over time, as well as any differences across countries or institutions that might have incentives or funding available for their authors. And then looking at disciplinary differences, once there's enough publications, you could actually repeat this analysis for different journals of the 38 different journals and look at how it might vary across more medical fields or other fields to see if that varies at all. Again, we couldn't do that based on the number of articles that were available at the time. And then finally, just trying to figure out how to increase access to open access for authors. So we know that open access is really important. It can bring a lot of benefits to authors. We know it helps increase equity and access for readers, but how can we make sure that it's also accessible and equitable to authors? And whether we do that through a revision of waivers or rethinking how institutions or countries or other organizations could help fund some of this APCs or cost to publish. And as a quick reminder, some of our key takeaways are that the geographic diversity of authors publishing in OA mirrored journals is significantly lower than non-OA parent journals. We think APCs create a greatest barrier to publishing open access for researchers based in middle-income countries, particularly those who don't have national or institutional support. We really need to rethink the OA funding model so that we can promote diversity of authors from all around the world. And overall, we need to develop strategies that ensure that the prestigious open access journals, the ones that are beneficial to authors for publishing, are truly accessible to all researchers and scholars. And finally, we have a ton of people to thank, people who helped us gather the data from Scopus and as well as putting together the code, for reviewing the manuscript, for helping us rethink conceptually how we look at this. And then of course, our co-authors, some of whom are here today, and hi everyone, as well as of course, Dr. Bruna, who has helped us learn about publishing, learn about open access, and then literally took us through the entire publishing process to get this wonderful piece of work published. So thank you everyone, and thank you everyone who's here for listening.
Thank you.
And finally, please let us know if you have any questions or comments.